Hello everyone. This video is going to teach you how to use AWS Amplify to build a full stack application. For the front end, we're going to be using ReactJS, and for the back end, we're going to be using Node.js combined with an API gateway endpoint and a Lambda function to host our REST API. I'm going to walk you through all the steps and explain to you all the settings along the way. So let's get started. All right, guys, so here we are in Visual Studio Code. This is a completely empty project, and we're going to be starting from scratch here. Now, before we get started, there are a couple prerequisites. You need npm, you need the Amplify CLI, and you need Git installed. If you don't have those things, I'll leave some links down below that you can learn how to do that. But from this point forward, I'm going to assume you have all those things installed. So first of all, let's just create a basic application using npx. So we're going to say npx create React app, and I'm just give this a name. So I'm going to call this Amplify demo app for this case. So this is going to download a whole bunch of dependencies. This may take a little while here. If it takes too long, actually that was pretty quickly. Maybe not. If this takes too long, I'll do some movie magic and fast forward this for you. All right, so everything finally finished. Let's just switch into that project directory now and then just run npm start to make sure that everything was set up correctly and we just get a basic hello world application on our browser here. All right, so this loaded up a browser tab on localhost port 3000. You can see we just have a very basic React application now. So we can close this out, and I'm just going to go back into our code editor here to actually get started with the Amplify part. So just Control-C to terminate, end there, and let's just clear everything off here. All right, so our next step is to run Amplify init, and this is going to initialize our project. We just have to fill out some very basic things here. So it's asking us for a name for our project. You can change this or leave it as default. By default, it just takes the name of your folder. So I'm going to press enter there. We're going to set up a dev environment. That's fine. I'm using Visual Studio Code here, but you can pick something else. Another good one is IntelliJ. So Visual Studio Code is good. We're going to be doing this with a JavaScript-based application, and we're going to be using React. And source for our directory path is fine as well. Basically leave almost everything default here. Yeah, you can leave that as the build command and start command, and we're going to be using AWS CloudFormation. So at this point, there's some initialization steps that need to happen with AWS Amplify. So we need to point it now to our AWS CLI profile, because it does use the AWS CLI in order to launch and deploy your code into AWS. So if you've already set up your CLI, then you just can use a profile. So I'm just going to press Y here, and I'm just going to select my Amplify demo profile that I already created. Now, optionally, if you pressed no, then you can go ahead and create a user, an IAM user, and go grab those access keys and the secret access keys and just put them in here. Keep in mind, you do need like administrative access in order to do that. So I'm just going to select Amplify demo here. And this should close out pretty quickly, and then we should be able to take a look at our code. So what's happening right now is that you see adding backend environment dev to AWS Amplify console app. So there are some things, and you can see like a bunch of stuff happening here in the console. And this is where some people get a little bit confused in terms of what Amplify is actually doing. We're seeing like create in progress, it's creating a bucket, an auth role, create complete. Like how is it doing all of this stuff? And like, how do you actually see this in AWS? So it turns out what's actually happening is that we're using a technology called AWS CloudFormation. And this is a service that's offered by AWS that lets you write infrastructure as code. And more specifically, it lets you write template files that you can upload to CloudFormation, and that creates AWS resources for you. So we're going to let this run for a second. I'm going to go into the console now and show you a little bit about what is happening. So I just have my console browser up, and I'm logged into my account that's linked with this profile. And we're going to go into CloudFormation. If it's not here, you can just search for it up at the top here. So I'm going to go into CloudFormation. And here you're going to see a bunch of different stacks. Now, the bottom two are ones that are just for my personal project, so don't worry about that. But you can see here there's this top one, Amplify, and then Amplify Demo App. That's the name of the project that we just created, Amplify Demo App. So if I click on this now, we can start to see a little bit about what Amplify is actually doing behind the scenes. And this is important if you're using Amplify, because a lot of people get confused because they think Amplify is doing all this magical stuff, but they don't know what it's doing on the back end. So pay attention to this. So all of those things that we were seeing in our terminal are also visible on the events page. So if you come here, and let me just like zoom out my tab so you can see a little bit better and just expand this. So you can see like this is an event log of all the things that AWS Amplify is creating for us through that CloudFormation template file that it is also generating. So you see here all this information like create in progress, create complete. This is giving you status updates in terms of all the resources that Amplify is creating. A lot of this stuff right now is just like bootstrap boilerplate that you don't really need to care or know about. But it's important to know like everything else, when you add a backend, it's all going to work the same way. Amplify uses CloudFormation to deploy your resources. So when you add like a API, for example, you're going to be able to come back later and see an API gateway, a Lambda function, and a whole bunch of other resources that are going to be present that are necessary for that setup to work. So just keep that in mind. Now, if you want to narrow down this and just look at like what resources are being created, then you can go to the top tab and click on resources. So this is going to show you the specific things that are created. And if you look at the type section, you can see AWS IAM role, AWS S3 bucket, and another AWS IAM role. And you can see that they're all completed successfully. So that's what's going on. This is how Amplify and CloudFormation work together to add all this cool stuff to your project. Now, before we go back to the console and resume with adding the next components, I just want to go into the Amplify section now to show you kind of the same thing. So let's go to the top and type in Amplify. And so we got AWS Amplify. And since we just initialized our project, you can see now that we have access to our application here. So if I click on this guy, this will bring us into kind of the like front end portal for Amplify. And so you can click around here and see what's going on. There's nothing really that exists. We just created basically an initialization project with a backend. So it's got a dev environment set up. You can see there's no front end environment. We'll get to this a little bit later on, but you can come here a little bit later. Like you can even come here and click and see what's going on. There's a bunch of different pieces here, but really nothing special. So let's go back now to our terminal to move on to the next steps now. All right, so before we go ahead and add our API, I just want to show you the file structure to give you an idea of what is actually happening here. So you can see now in our code section here, if I expand this out a little bit, a whole bunch of project files got created. There's a README, there's package.json, there's all sorts of things that are happening here. So you can go ahead and read the READMEs to understand a little bit more about the project, but let me just give you kind of the TLDR. So the source project, or the source folder rather, is where all of our ReactJS code is going to be. It's all in this folder. So like app.js, you can see this is very familiar React code. Just close that out. Everything that has to do with Amplify in terms of the backend will be in the Amplify subdirectory here. So you can see in Amplify, then there's a backend folder. And right now there's nothing in here. This was just like an empty project that we just created. But when we add our API, when we create our Lambda function, we're going to have a subfolder here that's going to give us access to the code that we need to modify in order to add business logic to our Lambda function. So you can like poke through the files here and see what's going on a little bit. There's like a couple configuration files, there's tag files, a whole bunch of things here that don't really matter at the end of the day. You may have to come here and dig through stuff on occasion, but for all intensive purposes, you don't really need to care right now. All right, so let's move on to the next step now, which is to actually add our API. So I'm going to type in Amplify add API. And this is going to load up a wizard now that's going to prompt us with a whole bunch of questions with regards to our API. So the first question is to please select from one of the below mentioned services. Do we want to use GraphQL or REST for our backend? So if you want to use GraphQL, you're going to be using AWS AppSync. That's the service name that the GraphQL is hosted on. That's a little bit beyond the scope of this tutorial. I want to use REST in this example. That's going to allow us to use API Gateway and a Lambda function. It's just a lot simpler when getting started with the GraphQL stuff. You know, you need to know GraphQL first of all, then it generates a lot of extra boilerplate that you need to sift through. So I'm just going to start with REST and then we can build off that. Maybe I'll do GraphQL in a different video. So I'm pressing enter now with REST selected. And now it's asking us to provide a friendly name for your resource to be used as a label for this category in this project. I'm just going to leave this as default. It's just putting together a random string there. So we're going to press enter. Now the next thing, we need to specify a particular option. Now it's asking us for the path of the REST API that we want to create. So the one that I want to create is /customers. And then we're going to use open close squigglies. And inside of that, we're going to say customer ID. And so this is going to be our REST endpoint for customers. So whenever someone passes in a integer or a value after the second slash there after customers, we're going to basically query for that customer ID in our database. We're not going to set up a database now, but that's what's going to happen at the end of the day. All right, so go ahead and press enter now. And then it's asking us to choose a Lambda source. I want to create a new Lambda function to host our API. And then it's asking us to provide a friendly name for your resource to be used as a label for this category in this project. So I'm going to leave this as default as well. And then it's going to provide the AWS Lambda function name. This I want to specify because I want to go and poke at the Lambda function a little bit later just to see what it's doing. So I'm going to call this customer handler. And now it's asking us for the language of choice that we want to use. Like I said in the beginning, we're going to be using Node.js for this backend. Okay, so now it gives you a couple different options here of the templates that you want to use. I would suggest just starting out for the first time using Hello World. If you use the CRUD function for DynamoDB, again, a lot of extra stuff is going to be provisioned and it's just going to confuse you. I don't suggest starting with that. Lambda trigger, this probably uses some kind of event to trigger the Lambda function, and serverless Express.js, I'm not really sure what this even does. So I'm just going to start off with Hello World just to set the context of how everything works, how it's all wired together. And then you can come back here later and experiment with some of these other ones. All right, so selecting Hello World, and then do you want to access other resources in this project from your Lambda function? Let's say no for now. That can change later, and we can modify this later if we want to. So pressing N for no. Do you want to invoke this function on a recurring schedule? If you want to use CloudWatch events to basically invoke this function every minute or every 5 minutes or every hour, every day, or at a particular time of the day, every day, then you would press yes here. But I don't want to do that, so I'm going to press no and move on to the next step. Do you want to configure Lambda layers for this function? Lambda layers allow you to easily add new dependencies that you can share among your Lambda functions, especially if they're very large dependencies like machine learning stuff like PyTorch or even like pandas if you're into data engineering. I'm going to press N here for no just to keep this simple. And do you want to edit the local Lambda function now? You can press yes here if you want, but we're going to do this anyway, so I'm just going to skip this and show you where the code is located so we can run through it step by step. So I'm going to press no for now, and just give us a bunch of different texts here to read through if you want. I'm going to go over some of this later, so don't worry about it. It's asking us now if we want to restrict API access. No, we want to be able to call this from the internet, so let's just leave this as N for now. Do you want to add another path? No. And we're pretty much done now. It's giving us a preview of what the next steps will be, but let's just take a look at what we actually did. So I'm going to clear that out. Now, if you look at our code structure now, you can see some interesting things happened. Before in the backend folder, we only had like these different metadata files that were located here. Now we have two different things. We have a folder for APIs, and this is the name of our API. It's this just random string here. And there's some details here in terms of like configuration as well. You can go through this, but it doesn't really matter. This is just basically a reflection of what we just configured in our wizard. So I'm going to close these out. But the thing that is important, if I can close these correctly, minimize that, is inside the function folder. And this is where all the code is going to be for your Lambda function. So if you go to function and then you go to the source folder, you should see in index.js, this is going to be your code that's going to be passed off and deployed into AWS with Lambda. In addition to that, you can see there's an event.json file that's located here as well. So if you want to pass in custom input into your Lambda function while you're testing, like say you want to test this on local before you publish it out into the cloud, you can put some extra data in here to simulate what your Lambda function will take as input, and then you can run this locally. So it's a really handy feature for you to kind of test everything out before you actually deploy to be confident that everything is working correctly. All right, so what I want to do now is I want to go ahead and modify that index.js file. So I'm going to remove everything here, and I'm just going to drop in some code that I've already written for us, and we can take a look at what's going on here. Let me lower my terminal here to make more room. Okay, cool. So we just have a basic handler here, and we're just taking an event as input. I'm just console logging the event. This is always a good idea, by the way, because it's really useful for testing, especially when you're first setting up a Lambda function. Often you want to extract certain parameters or certain fields from the input events. So it's useful to just log this out, and this is going to go into CloudWatch where you can take a look at it later on. The next thing that we're doing is we're setting a constant to customer ID, and we're looking at the event that was passed in. Now within that event object, is something called path parameters. And then there's going to be something within that called customer ID. Now remember, our Lambda function, our API gateway function, the input was /customers, and then inside the squiggly brackets was customer ID. So what this is going to allow us to do is, like, our API looked like this, right? So there we go. So our API looked like this. It was /customers and then /some value. And this value, this thing right here, the 1, that's going to be mapped to the name or the field customer ID. So customer ID in this case, if we were to pass in, like, or call this API with this setting here, with this input, the customer ID would be equal to 1 here. So that's what's going on. And we may take a look at what the input object looks like a little bit later, but that's why it's important to log out the event on the first line, because it's going to help you understand what's inside that object and be able to pull out exactly what you need. Now, the next thing that we're doing is, like, normally I would call a backend to say, like, this is my customer ID, select from database, where customer ID is equal to 1 in this case. But I'm not going to do that for right now. I'm just going to return a hard-coded response. So I'm just going to create a object called customer. We're going to just give back the customer ID that we just got. So customer ID 1 in the previous example. And then we have a customer name field. And then I'm just saying customer plus customer ID. So this would be customer 1 under the customer name key. And then from there, we are just returning a response. So we're going to do status code 200. And you also want to uncomment the lines here. You can see this comment here. So uncomment below to enable CORS requests. So you're going to want to do this because in a later step, we're going to be going back and running this again on local, and it won't work unless you have CORS enabled. So just keep that in mind. Make sure you uncomment these 4 lines here all under the header section. And then from there, for the body, we're just passing in this input object up here. And we're just stringifying it so that it's in a nice, pretty format. And then finally, we're just returning this response object all the way back to the caller, and the caller should get everything that you see here. All right, so now what we can do is we can just type in Amplify. Actually, make sure you save that or else this will not go well. You can just type in Amplify push, and this should give you a little bit of a preview of what AWS or what Amplify is going to deploy to AWS rather once this thing wakes up. And so what is it telling us here? So it's saying we have a function called this thing and we're going to create it. And then we have an API called this thing and then we're going to create it as well. So just to give you an idea of what's happening, Amplify is looking at what we have on local. Like we added that API through the console, right? Amplify add API, but we haven't actually reflected that in the AWS cloud yet. This is all just sitting on local. Now, in order to take what we have on local and deploy that up into the cloud, we need to run that Amplify push command. And that's what basically we're seeing here. We're seeing a diff between what we have on local and what exists on the cloud. So I'm going to just type in Y now for yes. And the same thing as last time is going to happen. You're going to see a whole bunch of stuff streaming down our screen here. And CloudFormation is going to be updated and a whole bunch of other things are going to be updated in the Amplify section as well, which we're going to take a look at pretty quickly. So you can see here, update in progress, auth role, function, blah, 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 blah. Let's just let this do its thing for a little while. And I want to go and take a look at what is happening now in CloudFormation. So let's go back to CloudFormation. CloudFormation. There we go. Click on that guy. Come on, let's go. Oops, sometimes it's a little bit buggy. I don't know why. Okay, let's try this way. Going here and CloudFormation. Oh, is the console down? Okay, there we go. That was bizarre. That took way too long. All right, so now what is actually happening now? So we have two different stacks. This was the original one that we created from the beginning. And now we have something called a nested stack. Now it turns out that this thing here is the parent. So this is the top level stack. And below that is the API stack that we just created. And so this is like a little bit going into the weeds of how CloudFormation works. You have these things called stacks, and stacks are just logical namespaces that contain all of the things that you're trying to create. And you can separate them out into different stacks if you really want. And then within one stack, like a top level stack, like the one that we have here, this can be for like a whole project. And then you can build nested stacks within that. One nested stack for an API, one for a database, one for authentication, yada, yada, yada. So that's what's happening here. Amplify is creating a nested stack now that's going to contain all of our API and Lambda function resources. So if I just refresh here, okay, so everything was successful. That's great. So let's click on it. It actually created two. I'm just trying to take a look to understand. So one was for the API and one was for the function. So you can see that it's not really clear. It's got the name function in there, and then it's got the name API in there. So that's how you differentiate between the two. So let's just click on the function one really quick to take a look at what it did. Again, we can go to events if we want to see exactly what happened. So it was creating an execution policy, it was creating a function, it was creating a role. These are all the updates that occurred on it. Going back to the top for resources, and you can see here, we created a couple things, an IAM role for the Lambda function itself, and then a policy that's going to give us permissions to do what we need to do. And then if we go back now and just check out that other one for API, this should have some API gateway details in it. So let's just go to resources, and you can see if you expand this, we did an API gateway deployment, we created a REST API, and we added our Lambda function's permission to be invoked as a result of that REST API being invoked. So that's kind of what happened here behind the scenes to give you a better idea of what CloudFormation is actually doing with Amplify. And again, if we go back now into Amplify, I'm not going to do this every time, but this just kind of gives you a good idea of what is happening. If we go into this now and we click on dev, yeah, you can see here there's two different categories that are added. We create a function and an API. You can click on these if you want. I'm just going to go into API, and actually that's wrong. Let's go back here. API, and I thought it would give you a little bit more information here. It's a shame that it doesn't. Let's try to go to functions and see if it gives you anything. Yeah, so it tells you kind of what is going on, or logs for your function rather. So you see this is just some logging information, not very useful. To be honest, I wouldn't suggest using this to come and take a look at what's happening with the Lambda function itself. I would just go to the Lambda section of the console to take a look. So the way that you can do that is just go to Lambda, and now we should see a customer handler function that we just created. So let me just filter here, customer, and then it's got the environment. Remember, our environment that we set up initially with the project was dev. That's what we have set up here. And if we click on this now, and you look at the code, this was the code that we previously just modified, right? You remember I was talking about that customer stuff and JSON stringify with the customer. So you can see how this all wires together now. These resources are being created behind the scenes on behalf of you through AWS CloudFormation via Amplify. All right, so that's it for kind of the rundown of what is happening behind the scenes. Let's go back to our code now and see where this all left off. All right, so if we look at the bottom here, we can see now our REST API endpoint is now available. So this is where our REST API is hosted. So if we click this, we should be able to invoke our function, or so you would think. And I'm going to show you why that's not the case. So I'm just going to click this, or control click. There we go. And you see here, if I expand this out, missing authentication token. Oh no, we did something terribly wrong. That's not the case, actually. I'm just kidding. Now, the reason that it's showing us the missing authentication token is because we have not hit the correct URL. We've just hit the environment URL, the dev URL. So what we need to do is do /customers. And then remember, we need to pass in that customer ID now. So let's pass in customer ID 1. And if you remember, what should happen right now is that we should get a return object that says customer ID 1, and then customer name should be customer 1. So you can press enter now, and you can see that's exactly what's happening. We're getting a response from our Lambda function end to end, and now you can do like customer ID 2, and you can see it's changing every time. Now, ideally, you would call a database here to do all this stuff, but not for this example, maybe for another video. So that's how it all fits together. Now, just to summarize really quick, so we created an Amplify project, we added an API, we coded up our function with a very primitive implementation, we pushed our function to AWS through the Amplify CLI, we got a URL, and now we are testing that URL. Because this is a GET API, this is going to work. But if it was a post, I'd have to do this like through Postman or some other way to put the content in the body. All right, so that's all you need for now. Now, one thing before we leave off, because some people lose this URL, unfortunately, and don't know how to get it back. So let me just show you really quick how to do that. So I'm back in my AWS account. Let's go to API Gateway. and API gateways here. And so this is the API that we just created. It's got the funky name. Clicking on this. And now I believe if you go to stages, if I'm not mistaken, dev, yeah, stages dev, and then you can see the invoke URL up here. So this is the same URL that we just used to query, but this is how you can recover it in case you forget to copy it, forget to paste it, yada, yada, yada. This is an easy way to recover. All right, so let's go back to our terminal now and proceed to the next step. Now, before we do that, I just want to show you a quick little way to test your function out locally. So you can type in the command amplify mock function. Let me just move my mouse for you there. And then just put in the function name. So mine was called customer handler. Now this isn't going to work because what's going to happen is that it's going to try and read the event JSON, which is this format. This doesn't have customer ID in it or that what did I code it up? It doesn't have path parameters either. So this is going to error out. But if you wanted to test this out to try it and see how it works, and maybe you can fix it up to pass in the correct format for the event.json, this is how you would test it out to make sure. And of course, this is giving me some kind of error for some reason. You know why? Because I need to pass in this. Technically, the function name or the function tag is this value here. I don't think I can copy. Can I copy that? Is that going to work? No, this isn't going to work, is it? Oh my God, is everything crashing? Okay, I don't know. We're not going to do that. But if you wanted to get this to work, then you would just replace customer handler with this guy here, and this would all work just fine. So let's clear all this and let's move on now to the next step. All right, so our next step is to install the dependencies that are needed to call our endpoint from our React application on the front end. So we've created our backend, we have our API, it's all set up. Now we just need to install a bunch of UI toolkits that integrate with React so that we can do things like call our REST API very easily. If you were doing other things like adding authorization or authentication with Cognito, which is another feature of Amplify, you would get like all the widgets that are built in with React and you can just import them and use them. But it turns out in order to call our API on the back end, there's a very handy library that you can use that's provided by AWS Amplify. So that's what I want to do. So I'm going to type in the command npm install, and we're going to say AWS-amplify, and we're going to say AWS-amplify/UI-react. And hopefully this doesn't take too long, but again, I'll fast forward it if it does. All right, guys, so that took a year once again, but everything did finally finish. What we need to do now is we need to go and modify our ReactJS code. So I'm just going to close out this stuff here and just minimize some of our backend stuff going on. So if you recall, our ReactJS code is located under the source subdirectory. So first of all, let's go into the index.js file, and I just want to import some essential things that we need to get that React UI library or that Amplify UI library into our project. So I'm just going to come here and drop in some imports here. So we're importing Amplify from AWS Amplify, AWS exports, and we're just calling this default configure command. You can read up on what these things do on your own time, but they're just getting all of our assets into our project. All right, so next what we want to do is we want to go over to our app.js file, and let me actually just lower this terminal. It's way too large. So it does basically nothing special here, this project file. So I'm going to remove everything here. Let's delete all of this stuff, and I'm going to paste in this large block of code that I'm going to run you through. And I'm going to be making this code available, by the way, so don't worry about having to copy it down or anything like that. I'm going to put a gist where this link is available, and so you can play with this on your own time. All right, so let me explain what's going on here. So first of all, at the top, we're just doing some imports. Keep in mind, we're importing this thing called API. This is basically an easy way for us to perform REST requests against our API gateway endpoint. It handles a lot of the configuration for us, and you'll see what I mean in a minute here. Then we're just importing some React state stuff as well. Now first of all, we're setting a constant to some value here, and this is basically the name of the API. I had a previous value there that was just from my clipboard that was from my previous example, but we need to find the right value for this. So in order for us, I just want to pause there so that we can get the right value. Now, this is the name of the API that we accepted as autocomplete when we were running the npm add API wizard. So in order to find out what the right value is here, you need to go to your project under the Amplify subfolder, and you need to go to backend, you need to go to API, and you can see it's right here. It's in the name. And I'm sure that this name is somewhere else in these configuration files, but this is just where I found it first. So I'm just going to copy mine out. So it's called API DDC9AF89. I wish I named that better in the beginning, but live and learn. The next thing we have here is a reference to our path, which in this case is customers. And then I'm doing some ReactJS stuff here. So let's just scroll to the bottom where the UI or the render function is and explain what's happening. So this is a super simple React app. It's basically got a input field that asks for a customer ID. And then it's got a button that is going to invoke this get customer function. And this is where the call to our backend is going to occur. And then once we get that result, we're going to just basically print all of this stuff out in a nice, easy to look at way. So every time you click the button, whatever input is in the input box, it's going to trigger a invocation to our backend through that API. And it's going to be added to a list so you can see all the stuff that's being returned. That's basically it. Now, if we go into the get customer API to take a look at what's going on here, so we're just grabbing the customer ID from the input box. We're using that API get method, and then we're passing in our API name. That's what we had up here. We're giving it the path, which is /customers. We're adding a slash, and then we're putting in the customer ID. And then after we get the response, we're just logging it out. We are creating a copy of new customers. We're adding the response that we got from the backend to that array. And then we're just updating state so that everything gets reflected on the UI. So that's looking pretty good right now. So let's just test all of this out. So I'm just going to run, I think it's npm run or npm start. I can't remember what it was. Yeah, it's probably npm start. And this should load up our dev server on local. And once we confirm that we get this working, we can actually deploy the front end up to the cloud as well by following a subsequent command line function. So again, I don't know, for some reason on my machine, this takes a little while to start the dev server. So I'll fast forward this really quick for you. All right, guys, so here is our super simple React app. Now, before I test everything out and prove to you that this is working, let's just open up our dev console. Let's just put this on the bottom since I'm not a savage. Okay, go to our network tab and we're going to be able to see all of our API calls here. All right, so let's put in some values here. So let's just put in foobar and call customer from the backend. You can see we got a response. It's got foobar, which is what we passed in. And then we got customer foobar. And if we look now, if I can manage to make this bigger somehow, how do I do this? We'll just go like this. There we go. So we got foobar there, and you can see that this is the request that got made. So we're calling that endpoint with customers foobar, and we got a response back. So you can put in a whole bunch of different values in here. So customer 1, customer 2, customer 3. This is how you get your simple application up and running very quickly using Amplify and React. Now, this is all running off local, remember. This isn't good enough. So this isn't on the cloud, at least our React app, that is. Our backend is on the cloud, but our front end is not. Now, in order to get that working, we still have some work to do. So let's go back to our console now, or our terminal rather. Control C to kill the project, and no. And let's just run some additional commands now to launch this all the way up to the cloud. So just going to clear that out. What we need to do now is Amplify add hosting. And this is going to allow us to host it through the Amplify console. Pressing enter there should ask us a couple questions. So select the plugin module to execute. First option is to host with the Amplify console, which is managed hosting with custom domains, continuous deployment. The other option is with CloudFront and S3. I'm going to use the first option for now. This is by far the simplest. The second one is more optimized, allows you to use CloudFront, which is a regional edge cache with your asset files located in S3, but it's a little bit more complicated. So let's just stick with the first one for now. And then there should be a second option here, if I'm not mistaken. Is anything going to happen? There we go. All right, so choose a type. You can either pick continuous deployment if you want to source the project from a Git repository. Using this approach, the Git-based approach, anytime there's a change in your Git repository, it'll integrate, so it'll redeploy your function code into the cloud, so you don't have to do any manual deployments. But that does require that you have your Git repository set up and everything linked up together, which I do not. And if you do select this option, it'll ask you a whole bunch of other questions as well. So let's just select manual deployment for now. And that should be pretty much it. Now, all we need to do is commit to that. Again, we're going to type amplify publish. Should give us a preview of what it is going to change. or it'll just do it. I can't even remember. Let's just wait and see here. And we should be almost there. All right, yeah, so it did give us a preview. So you can see we're adding hosting, we're just modifying our function and our API. We're gonna press Y, and we should see a brand new URL that gets spit out that is custom for our project that we can share with users and they can interact with our application. So let's just give this a second here. All right, guys, so you can see here things finally finished and it spit out a URL for us. So I'm just gonna command click on this so we can open it up in our browser. And here you go. So here's the new version of the application. So this one is hosted on this URL on the Amplify app subdomain. And you can see all of this stuff is going to work exactly the same as before. Still going to be calling our backend. You can do this as many times as you want and just test things out. So this should give you a pretty good starting point for your Amplify application. Just one last thing before you go, how to delete all this stuff. If you want to tear all this stuff down really quick, all you need to do is just type in Amplify delete. And this is going to tear down everything. It's going to ask you some prompt questions here, which you can add yes or no to. And all of this stuff is going to be deleted for you with just a couple clicks. So that's it for this video. If you enjoyed this, check out the other ones on the right for Amplify. And don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.